Great, well, welcome. We are excited to be sharing updates with you today on the Fauntleroy Ferry Terminal Replacement Project. My name is Lauren, and I'll be your meeting facilitator today. Thank you so much for being here. Today, we are going to hear from the Washington State Ferries team about the concepts that we're studying to identify the best path forward for the Fauntleroy Ferry Terminal. And I want to start by thanking the many members of our community advisory group, our technical advisory group, and executive advisory group who've guided this work over the past year. We really couldn't do this without the input from members of each of the Triangle communities, our agency partners, local jurisdictions, and tribes. And we are looking forward to hearing from more of you during this meeting. So before we get started, let's talk about how you'll be able to participate today. The question and answer box is available for you to submit questions at any time throughout the presentation. We'll be conducting a few polls throughout the meeting, which will pop up within the Zoom platform, so you shouldn't need to close out or go anywhere else. And we'll be taking all questions today using the Q&A box. So if you're calling in by phone and you can't access the Q&A feature on a computer, you can raise your hand to ask your question aloud. And you can do that by dialing *9. I don't see any participants by phone right now. And to help us manage the Q&A, we ask that those of you joining by computer please not use the raise hand feature, and we'll only call on raised hands that are associated with a call-in participant. Other than that, we will read questions aloud for our project team to respond to. We'll do our best to get to all of your questions, but we may combine them or respond later if we don't have time. We are recording this meeting and we will capture all of the questions and comments in our meeting summary. So again, please submit your questions as they come to you throughout the presentation, and we'll just save them for the Q&A session, but then you don't have to remember them. If you are having technical difficulties, you can use the Q&A to let us know, or you can call our technical support specialist at 206-979-8721. All right, so what are we going to cover today? We'll provide a brief overview of the project, followed by a discussion of the various options that we've been studying in our process so far. Then we'll share out next steps and open the floor for your questions. So I'm going to hand it over to David Sowers from Washington State Ferries in just a moment to get us started. But first, we'd like to know who's in the room with us today. So please take a moment to respond to a few polls that are about to pop up for you. All right, let's see. Where are you joining us from? Vashon Island, Fauntleroy, South Kitsap, or someplace else? All right. So it looks like about a third of you are calling in from Vashon Island. Welcome. A good portion are calling from Fauntleroy or West Seattle, and about 10% are coming from South Kitsap, so Port Orchard or South Worth or somewhere in that area. And then about a quarter of you are calling in from someplace else, and I'm very happy to have you with us. So we have one more question that we'd like to ask. Oops. And that is, how frequently do you ride the Fauntleroy Vashon South Worth ferry? Is it a rare occasion for you to head over on the ferry? Is it something you do on occasion a few times a month? Are you using it many days a week? Or are you using it not at all? So thank you for filling that out. It's looking like we've got a bunch of ferry riders with us here today, which is great. I'll wait for a few more of you to respond. All right. Great. So it looks like a good portion of you, about a third of you, ride several days a week. About a third of you ride occasionally, a few times a month, and about a third ride rarely. But all of you use the ferry in some way. Thank you so much for sharing a little bit about yourself. It's really great to have you here with us. And we're excited to share where we are with this project that will be interesting to hear about. All right, so I'm going to hand it over to David Sowers now, and he will share more with you about the project.
All right, thanks, Lauren. So again, my name is David Sowers. I'm the Director of Terminal Engineering for Washington State Ferries. So I'm in charge of planning, design, and construction of all of our ferry terminal projects, both planning, preservation type projects, as well as capital projects. We recently finished up a big project up at Mukilteo, and as well as we're working on the Coleman Dock project. So got a lot going on. I just wanted to kind of start off with a little bit of a review of and some background on the Fauntleroy Ferry Terminal and why Washington State Ferries is doing this project. The ferry terminal was built in the 1950s, and there's been a few minor upgrades since then, but it needs a substantial amount of work done to preserve it and maintain it so that we can ensure safe and reliable ferry service. In 2019, we published our 2040 long-range plan, and this is a document that we update every decade or so. And in that document, it recommended the replacement of the Fauntleroy Ferry Terminal, and I'll get into that a little bit more here in a second. That document also talked about replacing the new ferry terminal in Mukilteo and replacing or updating the terminal in Coleman Dock. So with all that work going on, we are now focusing our energies on Fauntleroy. We are very early in this planning process, and so we haven't jumped into the environmental review, and I'm going to come back and talk about that some more because I want to set some context to kind of where we're at today and what our goals are in the future with this process. We are currently working to narrow down a range of concepts as we move forward, and the hope here is that construction for this project could start as early as the 2025-2027 biennium. So let's talk a little bit about why this project's needed. Well, it is a 70-year-old ferry terminal, and it faces a number of challenges. First of all, rising sea levels. If we can go back a slide, thanks. The rising sea levels, as you can see in this photo, throw a lot of debris, and the increase of storms and intensity of storms can damage the ferry terminal and the utilities that are underneath that ferry terminal. As I said earlier, the terminal is aging and it's overdue for replacement. It is according to our asset management plan. And so the main structural elements are reaching the ends of the service life, which means they're beyond their capacity for continued support. And you can see these old piling in the picture on the right. It's also a very seismically vulnerable facility. The ground around the Fauntleroy is loose beach sands, and they can liquefy. And also the structure underneath the dock is not capable of standing a large earthquake. So again, reasons to upgrade and replace the facility. And then finally, as many of you know, there's a number of operational challenges. For one, the dock only holds about 80 vehicles. And so that makes it very challenging for us to process vehicles while we're loading. And we also have many backups onto Fauntleroy Way as a result, especially at peak times. So these are a variety of things of why we're replacing the project. The terminal is one peg of the Triangle Route, which you all know, serving West Seattle, Vashon Island, and South Worth on the Kitsap Peninsula. And it is also one of our busiest routes. It serves about 3 million riders pre-pandemic. I mentioned the dock's capacity. The vessel capacity serving this route is about 124 cars. It's an Issaquah class boat. You're all familiar with that since you're all ferry riders. It serves about 29 to 34 sailings per day between Fauntleroy and Vashon Island, and it serves about 23 to 27 sailings per day between Fauntleroy and Southworth. So it's a very, very busy route, as you all know. Because these communities are projected to grow over the next several decades, we are also looking at how to make this terminal as efficient as possible in our concepts for replacement. Okay, so This process started several years ago with a very public process to gather input on the triangle route. And through that process, we identified some near-term improvements, including a new sailing schedule, and got information that fed into that 24 long-range plan. In 2021, we launched this project with community meetings, and we formed 3 different advisory groups, a technical advisory group, a community advisory group, and an executive advisory group. Since then, we've been working through a planning study process, call it the PEL process. I'll describe that one a little bit more. And we don't expect construction to really begin in earnest until the earliest would be 2025 to 2027 timeline. But in the meantime, we are looking forward to your feedback because it's all part of this process and coming up with the best alternative that fits into the route the best. So let's talk a little bit about this planning process. It's called a planning and environmental linkages study. It's a fairly new concept that the public agencies are using to help identify alternatives before they go into the more formal NEPA-SEPA environmental process. It helps us develop high-level concepts for replacing the terminal and narrows down the range of concepts, we call them alternatives, to further study in this environmental review. The planning phase helps us identify transportation issues, environmental concerns, community's values, and of course the economic goals early in the project planning. So after this process is done, we move into what's called NEPA or SEPA, which is the National and State Environmental Policy Acts. And it's at that point that a preferred alternative is fully vetted and reviewed. And it's through this community involvement and the work with our advisory groups that we begin to pick up all of the features and select this alternative. So let me talk about the advisory groups a little bit. As I mentioned, we have a community advisory group, a technical advisory group, and we have an executive advisory group. These all are represented by folks from the various routes of various destinations on this triangle route, and they help to balance the perspectives and help us collaborate during the development of the project alternatives and screening criteria, which we're going to talk about a little bit more. This slide shows some of the statistics that we have from our community engagement so far, which, as Hadley reminds me, is in the thousands of comments received since we began the Triangle Task Force study several years ago. All right. So let's look at some of the options that we're going to be studying in this planning process. To date, we have completed an initial screening of many different options to replace the terminal based on suggestions that community members have shared with WSF over the years. We developed 15 different concepts, including 2 alternatives at Elliott Bay, 2 alternatives in the Burien Des Moines area, and then 11 different alternatives in and around Fauntleroy. We call this the level 1 screening, and the goal is to then narrow down the range of concepts to then study in further detail on what we call level 2. We evaluated how well each of these concepts meets the project's purpose and need, and other key considerations that our community and technical advisory groups helped us identify. So again, none of this was done in a vacuum, where there was a lot of input from the community and a lot of input from our technical advisory group members. So let's talk about what we considered. Well, we talked a little bit about the operational needs. We talked a little bit about the structural and seismic deficiencies and sea level rise. But we also took a look at other basic needs, including how the project may impact parks and local traffic flow, how challenging it would be to get a permit, and the types of issues that could come with those various alternatives in the permitting process. And then we also added as one of our screening criteria, project costs and potentially the need for additional right-of-way. Those are all important considerations as we move through this alternative selection process. So I'm going to cover at a high level what we learned. And again, as a reminder, this information is available in detail at our online open house. So after considering 15 different concepts, and you can see those listed across the top of this table, and the screening criteria, we developed this this level 1 results. And the green boxes indicate in here a high likelihood that the alternative could meet the criteria. The yellow boxes indicate a moderate likelihood that the alternative could meet the criteria. And then the orangey red boxes indicate little or no likelihood that the alternative could meet a given criteria. So we don't want to spend time or money studying concepts that had 3 or more red boxes as part of the project. They just don't fit enough of the criteria. Those labeled A through C, we plan to study more and refine in level 2 to find the ones that are going to best serve all 3 communities, the ferry riders and the terminal neighbors. So here's a list of the concepts that we will be studying more in the next phase of the project. I talked about level 2. And we're going to walk through each of these in a little more detail. First, you will note that all of these options reside at the current terminal location. And we'll talk more about the ones that in a minute, the ones that we're not going to look at. Several of these alternatives include operational elements like good to go or advanced ticketing. Again, that was input from our community members. And in the level 2, any of these concepts could be combined with some other operational efficiency. We did not study them in depth, and we will require a lot more work and planning to really understand what they will require to implement. Again, Washington State Ferries does not have a good to go, even though the highway side does a good to go process. And so that's something that we need to study, and the idea of advanced ticketing as well. We included them at this level to be able to study them more for these future stages. This will definitely be a topic for future community engagement. For now, it is a bit of a placeholder for potential operation efficiencies to help the dock work better. So as we continue to refine these alternatives, we can also consider elements like adding a second slip or overhead passenger loading. And those things have been talked about here, but we currently do not have the funding for these features. And so while we're holding them again as placeholders, we're going to see how the various concepts could accommodate them, those things in the future. Okay, so let's talk about those things that we won't study more. And these are the 6 that you saw on the previous matrix on the right-hand side. For one, moving the Fauntleroy Ferry Terminal outside of West Seattle drastically increases sailing times and decreases the frequency of the sailings, reducing the amount of ferry service to Vashon Island and southward, right? Changes our overall capacity of the route significantly. Moving the terminal to South Lincoln Park or to Loma Beach required purchasing more right-of-way, reconfiguring the local streets to create ferry access and provide fewer connections to transit. Again, all these things were going to have a significant impact on the ability to operate the terminal, and the impact on parks was also significant due to the amount of permitting that we'd have to do. Bringing an additional 3 million riders per year to downtown Seattle at Coleman Dock was a suggestion, but would slow our ferry service for all riders, and it would require extensive coordination and rewriting schedules to Bainbridge and Bremerton to accommodate all that additional traffic downtown. So these factors in Southwest Elliott Bay, Burien, and Des Moines would increase the overall project cost as well. They would affect our schedules and require extensive permitting coordination with multiple partner agencies. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Mark Bandy, who's going to kind of walk through some of our alternatives in more detail, and I'll turn it over to Mark now.
Great, thank you, Dave. So I'm going to talk through each of the alternatives that are progressing forward in just a bit more detail and talk about what we found. So let's begin with alternative A1. This replaces the dock at the same size and location as the existing terminal and holds 80 vehicles, with the shoulder holding lane the same as it is today to accommodate up to the 186 vehicle number. And what we found is this alternative meets many core elements of the purpose and need, but may not improve operational efficiency beyond what is how it's operating today. This is alternative A2. Again, we're replacing the dock at the same size and location as the existing facility, and this one includes good to go to improve operational efficiency. And there are many ways that good to go could be implemented, each with different implications. We don't yet have the details to share on how good to go would be implemented. That's part of what we'll be looking at in the next phase of this study. What we do know is that the implementation of Good to Go and related to changes to fare structure and the program could affect or delay the project schedule. This is alternative A3. This is, again, same dock size as current, and this one adds some form of advanced ticketing system for operational efficiency. Again, Washington State Ferries would need to evaluate the potential benefits and impacts that an advanced ticketing system would have and request authorization to change the fare collection process to support it. That process and policy change is something similar to Good to Go that could delay the project schedule. Alternative A4 is again here at Fauntleroy, same dock size, but this one to increase efficiency converts the southbound lane on Fauntleroy Way to a second holding lane, and as a result would make the remaining lane on Fauntleroy one-way northbound. You can see on the graphic with the arrows. The idea is to provide 2 lanes for separate destinations. This proposal would affect circulation in the area and require coordination with the city of Seattle as well as to the community. Alternative A5 supports vehicle processing through a different means by having traffic headed to destinations come from different directions. So vehicles traveling to Vashon Island would line up along Fauntleroy Way, and vehicles headed to Southworth would access the terminal from Southwest Wildwood Place. Similar to the previous alternative, this would change traffic circulation in the area, again requiring coordination with the City of Seattle, the transit agencies, as well as the community and neighborhoods in the area. And importantly, it's not clear whether a holding lane on Wildwood Place would leave sufficient room for transit to continue to operate. Alternative A6 is a concept that adds a remote holding lot near 47th Avenue Southwest. You can see it on the right side of the graphic rather than along Fauntleroy Way. This requires coordination with the City of Seattle to modify the traffic circulation. It also would require purchasing additional right-of-way to build the remote holding lot. And then, of course, Washington State Ferry operational changes on how vehicles are managed at the terminal and the remote holding lot. Alternative A7 also has a remote holding lot. In this case, it's using the existing south parking lot at Lincoln Park. In addition to the factors that were just mentioned on the previous alternative A6, this also requires more coordination with Seattle parks and permitting agencies, as well as a discussion with the community about impacts to Lincoln Park. Alternative B is an expanded dock. This dock replaces the current terminal with a longer dock that could hold up to 124 vehicles. Expanding the dock requires more coordination with partner agencies and tribes, and it would likely entail some more complex permitting that could affect the schedule. And alternative C is again an expanded dock at the current location. This is expanded to 186 vehicle capacity on the dock, in addition to extensive permitting discussions. This would require coordination with the King County Water Treatment Division over utility impacts, as well as near shore width, and Cove Park is identified on the slide. And with that, I think I'm handing it back to Lauren.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So Hadley Rodero, our Ferry's community engagement lead, will read your questions aloud for the project team to respond to. I don't see a lot of questions in the Q&A box. I know we just threw a lot of information at you. So in addition to, if you have questions or comments about what you saw, if there's anything that didn't make sense, that you don't understand, this is a great time to ask that now.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. You go ahead and type your question in the Q&A box and send it to us, and then we'll have our panel of project team members answer the questions. So while we're giving you time to think about it, I'm going to pose a question that's come up a lot in our online open house, where we've been collecting comments for the last few days. So Dave, there's been a lot of comments so far about interest in adding a second slip at the terminal. Right now, there's room for one ferry to dock at the Fauntleroy terminal. Have we considered adding a second slip there?
Yeah, that's a good question. And Hadley, that is not part of the current project, but it's certainly something that we're going to explore in terms of our maintaining operational efficiencies at the terminal. Similarly to overhead loading, we've gotten that question a lot. Those are not things that are currently in the plan. We do have multiple slips on Vashon, and we also do have a project program to add a second slip at Southworth. So we would have to weigh that and as part of this project and decide whether we could permit it, whether we had the budget for it, and whether it would help us operationally.
Okay, thanks, Dave. So we have a couple of questions here about Good to Go, which Mark mentioned, and Dave at the beginning. Why would implementing Good to Go delay the project schedule? Why could it slow down the process?
Well, I'll start, and then maybe Mark can add some more of the technical stuff to it. One, the Good to Go process is not something that Washington State Ferries has implemented. It's something that you all use when you're on Highway 405 or go through the SR 99 tunnel, but it hasn't been implemented. And so we're looking at it, we're thinking about it, we're talking about studying it, but it's the implementation of something like this would take some effort. And so we'd like to look at that in concert with our other planning and design efforts and see if it would be a good fit for this terminal and how we would incorporate it into not only Fauntleroy, but our system wide. Mark, do you have anything else you want to add?
Yeah, just a couple things, Dave, thanks. So a couple of things to think about it. One is that it could affect, well, basically there would be discussions with the Transportation Commission on changing adjustments to fare policy and processing. There is also, it's a new administrative process to add in the ferry system and accounts and processing. And so there's some financial questions that would come up in terms of revenue service that, again, would just take some time to work through.
Okay, thanks. So the next question, which I know is a popular one, we're also hearing online too. What would commuters do while construction is underway? And would folks be rerouted to the south end of Vashon Island, or how would that work during construction? And have we determined that yet?
We haven't determined that, Hadley. Certainly that's an important part of this project as we move into a preferred alternative. I mean, first of all, we don't want to impact our customers during construction. As you all know, we are working on the replacement of essentially the Coleman Dock facility in pieces, and it's been challenging, but we've been able to maintain and keep the ridership moving through to their destinations at Bainbridge and Bremerton. So with an eye towards that, our goal would be to maintain as much service as possible. And but it's also challenging to replace a facility that's as narrow as it is, kind of one lane at a time, while we maintain service and stage vehicles. So it's certainly something we're thinking about, but it's really for this next phase or even into the design phase when we really flesh out how we would do that.
Thanks. Our next question is about the two alternatives that include remote holding as part of the features of the new terminal. And the question is, would remote holding require additional labor, additional terminal employees to manage, or some sort of system to let people know information about ferry service, like visual paging? How much thought has gone into design of the remote holding lots and how they would operate?
Again, it's a concept that we have used in the islands. It's something that we're looking at Kingston. So it's a concept that Ferries is familiar with, but the person that came up with this question is kind of hitting it right on the nail on the head. It does require more staff. It requires that staff to be located remotely away from the toll booths and the terminal facility. So there's some challenges with that operationally. It was a suggestion that we had from community members to kind of put the holding area rather than on Fauntleroy at some offsite location, and then the cars would be a slow release of cars when vessel was loading would be would drive down Fauntleroy Way. So it has some merit, but it has its own operational challenges.
Okay, thanks, Dave. The next question is about seismic impacts. And the question is, how many earthquakes has the current dock withstood? And then also maybe you could expand a little bit more on why seismic resiliency is such an important part of the project.
How many? Well, that's a good one. Well, earthquakes, the ones that we don't feel. There's many of, but no, there was a good sized earthquake in 1965. Then there was the Nisqually event that in both cases the terminal did well. Those events were not at or exceeded kind of our base threshold level, so there was no significant damage. But the criteria that we design ferry terminals for now requires us to look at basically a reoccurrence interval of every 1,000 years. So it's a pretty high energy, high level event, and it would render much of the terminal either significantly damaged or even parts of it could collapse. So looking at it from that scenario, like we do with all of our ferry terminals, we need to build a better ferry terminal out of steel pipe piles that are driven deep into the ground and that are attached firmly to a concrete deck rather than the old timber style structure that's not very well attached and not fixed into the ground deep enough to resist liquefaction. So I love those seismic questions.
Thought you'd like that one.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to pause and remind all our attendees that we're taking questions. If you type your question in the box with the Q&A button on your screen, we're going to just take questions in the order that they're popping up. And some of them I'm seeing multiple people asking the same question. So I'm sort of bundling them together here if you don't hear your exact question read out loud. So the next question is about accessibility. How will access for people with disabilities factor into the project? For example, this commenter is saying pick up and drop off by the metro buses and taxis. How would that become part of the project design?
Well, I'll start. Maybe Mark can add some more to this, but I mean, we're required as a state agency to provide an all access ADA access facility. So we will continue to honor that and provide access to folks that are mobility challenged. The nature of the dock, as you all know, is narrow and it's difficult. Often buses are going the wrong way down the exit lanes to drop off patrons. And we're going to try to identify and resolve some of those things with the alternatives that we're looking at. But the details of how that's going to work haven't been sorted out yet. I don't know, Mark, do you got anything else you want to add to that?
The one thing I would add, Dave, and for the group is you'll see that we have a category in the level 1 evaluation that is multimodal connectivity, which is a catch-all for transit, ped, bike, as well as on demand or taxi services, including disability or wheel-bound individuals. And so we will develop and continue to develop information that helps evaluate this, the various alternatives and whether there's significant changes there. So that's the only thing I would add.
Okay, thanks, Mark. And while you're off mute, the next one's for you. At what point during the planning process will you look further at the traffic circulation impacts to the surrounding neighborhoods for some of the alternatives?
Sure, that's what's coming up in level 2. So for those, in addition to looking at terminal operations, you'll recall some of the alternatives had, they would affect circulation in and around the terminal, and that's when we would look at that in this next phase.
Okay, and then our next question, I'm going to ask Marcia Tolan, who's the environmental manager for the project, to join us, because I think this one you'll be able to answer, Marcia. The question is, why would alternative C require more permitting? And alternative C, for all the audience, is the one that is the 186 car dock that we showed as widening the dock to make it larger.
Thanks, Hadley. It's a good question. Alternative C actually it requires the same amount of permitting as most of the others. I think what was meant in talking about the complexity is the approval process that comes into play. It's a federal approval process for when we impact parklands. And so the widening of the dock for alternative C would impact Cove Park right next to it. And as a parkland, we'd have to undertake that federal process. And so that's the additional permitting impact, so to speak.
Okay, and that's a good transition to our next question is, do you have data on the usage of Cove Park? Is that something that the team has collected yet?
Well, that would be, somewhat in our next phase where we're doing reconnaissance level environmental existing conditions just looking at the existing conditions based on all categories of the environment and how those might specifically be impacted by each of the alternatives that are taken into level 2. And so looking at usage categories is for a park area would be a component of that at a broad scale.
Okay, thanks, Marcia. And this next comment, this person's pointing out that we really need to make sure we incorporate input by people with disabilities into our project planning, especially those who live on Vashon Island. So it's just a comment to share. That's a great suggestion. Thank you for that. The next question is, why could WSF move ahead with dock replacement within the current footprint while pursuing the policy changes necessary to implement pre-ticketing or good to go? Dave, do you have a response to that?
Well, I think that's what we'd like to do is we'd like to explore good to go, advanced ticketing. But at the same time, we don't want that schedule and any kind of pilot project out of that to continue to slow down the replacement of the facility. Irrespective, the facility needs to be replaced. I mean, you saw those pictures underneath the dock. So I see that as us working on parallel paths. And then as we flush out the good to go idea, if it has merit, we can implement it at some point.
Okay, back to remote holding, those alternatives that show a remote holding lot. Here's another question about sort of the operation of that. With remote holding, how would WSF prevent traffic from using the parking lane along Fauntleroy?
Yeah, so we were talking about this at Kingston because the same kind of question came up. There's a couple ways to do it. One, you can actually have a paper ticket that you hand to that person before they leave the remote holding lot that they have to hand to somebody on the dock so that you don't have people cutting in line. They actually do have license plate recognition. That's another technology we could implement. So there's a couple ways you'd have to do it. Again, it's not as simple as as it first sounds, but it's certainly we're looking at it at other terminals and we could try to implement it here.
Okay, Mark, this one, I'm not sure you have the data in front of you. So if you don't, that's fine. We can get back to this commenter. But the question is, what is the usage by single occupancy vehicles for this terminal?
Yeah, sorry, I don't have that at the tip of my tongue, but what I'd say is we can definitely follow up. We do have that information.
Okay, thanks. The next question is more along the lines of why we're carrying forward the variety of alternatives that we are carrying forward. And they're asking, are we keeping some of the alternatives on the table to make others seem more viable? So maybe you could speak more broadly, Dave or Mark, to sort of why we chose to carry forward the range that we are at this point.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and take a shot at that, Dave, if you're good with that. I think we are not purposely keeping things on just to make something else look good. What we're doing is, this process it began with suggested ideas that have come over the years from the community as input to WSF, and one of the reasons you go through a planning process is to generate information and have a discussion with partner agencies and the community to help increase understanding of how different ideas perform with regards to the goals and objectives of a project and of the system. And so as we learn more, you know, alternatives and ideas either fall off because they're not meeting the needs. But the other thing you can do as you go through this investigative process and discussion is you can find something in an alternative in terms of how you evaluate it and the information you generate that can help shape and refine another alternative. And so that's another reason to keep these things going forward and just kind of do a compare and contrast and refine.
Okay, thanks, Mark. The next question is another one about overhead loading. They're saying that they believe Fauntleroy is more car-centric than some of our other ferry terminals. So Dave, do you think that overhead loading would have much operational benefit for the terminal at Fauntleroy Terminal, or do we know that at this point?
Well, we don't, and that's part of these studies is to evaluate what kind of improvements overhead loading would offer in terms of maintaining our schedules, minimizing our dwell times, keeping our headways. You know, as an example, Anacortes is a very car-centric terminal, and yet we have overhead loading up there because it was determined that it provided a fair amount of efficiency, and it's also safety, keeping the passengers off the vehicle transfer span. Back to the ADA question earlier, if you've ever walked across the transfer span, there's lots of places that you can you know, kind of stumble, and you really have to be paying attention. So having an overhead loading structure allows our wheelchair riders to more easily get on and off the vessel.
Okay, thanks. Mark, our next question is there been consideration yet for adding a sidewalk on the east side of Fauntleroy Way?
We're not at that level of detail yet in the planning process, but I can certainly see that kind of idea is something as we think about that multimodal connectivity, those ideas, if they come up to kind of help facilitate that, then we'll be looking at those as we go into the subsequent phases.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to pause again and just let everyone know we're taking questions. If you have a question or a comment, you can share it in the Q&A box on your screen. And I'm going to keep taking our questions. We have a little more time here. The next question is we discussed this briefly at the beginning, but I think it's worth revisiting. With 2 slips at Vashon and 2 slips planned for the Southworth Ferry Terminal, has WSF considered putting 2 slips on the table for Fauntleroy, Dave?
We have not, in part because of what you just said, Hadley. There are places to dock the boats overnight and provide relief. So it hasn't come up as a driver for this project. Certainly something we can talk about, and I will add that whatever alternative is selected, we do need of the future, and whether it's overhead slip or some other feature, we will try to come up with an alternative that doesn't preclude the eventual use, you know, decades from now or even further out in the future, the ability to add those other features. But that complicates the permitting process that Marcia was talking about earlier when we start adding additional overwater structures. So not in the plans at the moment.
Okay. The next question is, do we know yet which of these alternatives is the most costly? And this commenter is saying that their guess is maybe alternative B and C, the larger dock alternatives, would have a higher cost. So is that true that those would be the most expensive?
Yeah, I think the commenter has the same eye as the rest of us. I mean, the longer, wider dock not only is costs more in steel and concrete, but it probably takes more time to permit. And so the overall length of the project adds to the cost, yes.
Okay, thanks. Next question is another construction impact question. Is the intent to close down Cove Park during any or all of the construction phase?
No. Again, like I said before, there's no plans to cut service or change the operations of the terminal while we're building the project. That being said, we don't have a preferred alternative, so I can't really answer specifics, but we do not want to limit people's access to the parks for sure.
Okay, and another Cove Park question, Marcia, this one I think you can answer. You're saying Cove Park is an environmentally sensitive area and also is the entrance to Fauntleroy Creek. What is WSF doing to protect this area as part of this project?
So, you know, as we look further and refine the alternatives in more detail, then we'll be able to understand how they impact those sensitive resources. But our primary objective would be to see how we can reduce the amount of impacts that we have as we move along through that. But with each alternative, the impacts are different, and we'll sort through them, and it's in that screening process at looking at the degree to which they would impact those sensitive resources would be fed into the results for that screening process and for which alternatives move forward. But so that's, you know, looking at it from that broad picture. But with all of the permits, we have to abide by their individual intent and mandate for protecting resources, and see how each alternative best responds to those. So by following those measures and intents and mandate for each of those regulations that uphold those permits, we are protecting those sensitive resources.
Okay, thanks. The next question is, what is WSF doing to maximize the use of the ferries during non-peak times? And I guess let's focus on what this project would do to maximize use of ferries during non-peak times. Dave, do you want to take that, or Mark?
I don't quite understand the question, I guess. When I was thinking about maximizing use of ferries, I was thinking about in terms of fare structures that we've used in the past to try to encourage folks to travel off peak. But I think that the question's not asking that. So maybe Mark, do you want to try to answer this one?
Yeah, well, sorry, make sure I'm off mute. Well, I think it's, I'll just answer it this way. I think you are identifying a possible solution or strategy. One of the things we know is that the long range plan has got the same vessel service. They're using the triangle route, and yet there's, you know, continued expected growth in the region and in the area. And so, you know, thinking about how the multimodal access as well as efficiency of the service throughout the day is going to be kind of aligned with increased use. So I don't know if it's a maximize, but just kind of meet the needs as the region continues to grow. So I guess that's how I'd answer it. And that's part of what we're going to be evaluating again in level 2 as we go through the rest of the planning process.
Okay, thanks. Mark, while you're off mute, I think you can answer this next one too. What is the project doing to reduce single occupancy vehicle use? And what is part of this process are we doing to meet that goal and to coordinate with King County Metro and other rideshare options?
Sure, happy to. It's a bit of what I was just saying on the kind of the modal integration aspects of the terminal. We also, with respect to coordinating right now in the planning process, we have both a technical advisory group and an executive advisory group that are helping us through this process. And both those groups include members from King County Metro, as well as Kitsap Transit to kind of help us in the transit space be thinking about that. The city of Seattle is obviously a partner as well in this for bicycle pedestrian connectivity with their planning efforts.
Okay. The next question is there any part of this project or Washington State Ferry's intent to make Fauntleroy Way a major transportation corridor?
Well, our intent is to meet projected growth rates that the Puget Sound Regional Councils come up with and that are in the long range plan. So I would say the answer is no, but we're trying to address we're not trying to create a major or a minor area. We're trying to just follow what is currently projected to be about a 30% ridership growth over the next 20, 25 years.
Okay. So we're nearing the end of our questions. If now's the time, if you have a question or a comment, to put it in the Q&A box. And I'm going to try to get to those of you whose questions we haven't answered yet, and others we will follow up later or include in our meeting summary. So the next question is, Marcia, maybe you can tackle this one first. Is it harder from a permitting point of view to rebuild the dock wider or to make it longer than the current width?
That I think both of those alternatives trigger some different aspects of the environment that the other one doesn't. So, it's not a quick and easy thing to say that one would take more time than the other. It would just be that the discussions and collaboration would be focused on different elements of the environment.
Okay, the next question is, do we know what are the destinations of the cars or the ferry riders after they arrive in Fauntleroy? Mark, do you want to take that one?
Sure. I won't state the number specifically, but we can provide that. But there is a origin destination survey information that generally shows the patterns of where people are heading to once they are coming off Fauntleroy. And it's, obviously it's a combination of going north to downtown and beyond and to the east side, and as well as staying in the South Seattle, West Seattle area. But we can follow up with the specific percentages because I don't want to misstate them.
Okay, we will put that in the chat in a few minutes. I'll make sure to link that to that origin destination study that Mark's referencing. So last question that I have now, if you have another one, put it in the Q&A box right now. But last question, if you add an additional lane along Fauntleroy Way, how would you maintain access to private driveways? They're constantly being blocked by ferry traffic, this commenter is saying. Dave or Mark?
Well, I'll go first. That's the problem with adding additional lanes on Fauntleroy Way, in addition to maintaining the C line and other transit options for folks. So it was an option. It was a proposal. It was one of the alternatives that was brought up by the community, and certainly something we took a look at it. But I think there are some serious challenges for how you keep those driveways open. It's enough now to have only one lane along the curb, let alone have two. Mark, anything else?
No, Dave, well summarized.
Okay, so one more question just popped up. How will this project reflect the Washington State Ferry's long-range plan goal to manage growth? Marcia, do you want to tackle that? Because I know it's part of our purpose and need statement to align with our long-range plan.
Well, by the goals that we set in our purpose and need, those will be part of what we're looking at and how well each alternative responds to that. I'm not sure if I have all the right input for this question, other than that we'll use that purpose and need statement to try to address your question. But because of the planning process, I think Mark had a really good explanation of the planning process in general, that it's the opportunity to open up dialogue and investigation about some different ideas that have been in play for responding to efficient transportation solutions, and those that operate efficiently, those that are smart in how well they protect the environment and respond to the community needs. So if we're following that goal, if we're keeping those in mind as we move along and address and look at each alternative and how they respond to the goals of the purpose and need statement, we would be effectively helping to respond to how it's managing for growth, because planning is that look ahead, the 20 to 40 year look ahead, and we're still in that process with this planning and environmental leakages process.
Okay, thanks, Marcia. Mark, did the initial screening criteria look at the carbon impact of the total commute via ferry to Fauntleroy versus the carbon impact by vehicle or passenger ferry to Coleman Dock?
Our level one did not look at that that specific comparison directly. Level one of looking at different alternative locations was looking at sailing times and frequency of vessels, and in terms of just looking at from the vessel perspective. This a carbon analysis would go into quite more analysis than we're at level one.
Okay. Dave, does Washington State Ferries 2040 long range plan call for a new class of ferry for the Fauntleroy Vashon Southworth route to streamline the fleet? Or maybe you could talk about what is in the 2040 long range plan in terms of vessels for this route.
Well, we certainly need new vessels. This route, though, will continue to maintain the 124 car vessel class. The 144 car vessel class has taken on different names as it's evolved. So maybe that's where the person asked the question is seeing something different. But no, we will continue to have 124 car vessels on this route.
Okay, well, that's all the questions we have today. And I know we're at our 1 hour mark, so I'm going to let Lauren come back on to close us out.
Thanks, Hadley. We actually have just one more poll before we go as we move forward in the level 2 process, to hear what you think is most important for us to study in level 2. So if we could launch that poll, and it has a number of topics here, but there's also an other option if there's something else that we don't have here that you think is important for us to study. So you might take just a minute to think about it. And of course, we also want to hear your more in-depth thoughts via our online open house as well. All right, thank you for starting to send in some of these votes. And of course, it's not a mutually exclusive situation. We'll be looking at all of these things, but we want to know what's really on your mind right now. Looks like we've got about 70% of you participating so far. We'll just give it another couple of seconds. All right, I don't want to take too much of your time, so we can just go ahead and end the poll. So looks like some of you are interested in the structural and seismic reliability. Many of you, 38%, want to hear more about maintaining on-time performance and moving people efficiently. Interested in impacts to traffic around the terminal, impacts to the natural environment and the neighborhood or surrounding communities. And also interested in hearing more about customer experience and multimodal connections. So thank you so much for sharing that information with us. And I'm going to go back a slide to the what's next. So our online open house is open right now through June 13th. We really hope that you'll share your comments with us there and let your neighbors and fellow ferry riders know that they can go there to learn about this project and share what they think. We'll continue after that time to convene our advisory groups to inform the level 2 screening process, where we will continue to refine these concepts and study them in greater detail. So we thank you for your interest in this project and invite you to go online to submit your comments. You can also visit the project website to learn more and sign up for email updates if you haven't yet. And if outside of the online open house period, you have questions or comments, you can always email our project inbox at fauntleroytermproj@washdot.wa.gov. So with that, that's all from us, and we thank you so much for your time and your interest in this project.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon,
everybody.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Have a good day.
everybody.